Hello, I'm Gail Kaufman, and welcome to my presentation for the Work and Family Researchers Network virtual conference. This is research on gendered employer policies in the United States, and I have done this with my colleague Richard Petz at Ball State. So, it's important to know that the US has no federal paid parental leave policy, right? So there's the FMLA, which is an unpaid policy, and there are some states, an increasing number of states that offer paid family leave. But because there's this lack of leave at the federal level, only 18% of workers in private industry have access to paid family leave. And even among those who have access to paid family leave, it's not a lot, right? So a recent study found that of those who took time off for the birth or adoption of a child, the median length of leave was only 11 weeks for mothers and only 1 week for fathers. Okay, just a little broad information about how parental leave policies come to be gendered. Right? We know that work organizations themselves are gendered places, and so workplace policies, including parental leave policies, also draw on notions of women and mothers as caregivers and fathers as breadwinners. And therefore, often parental leave policies are aimed, or at least have the intention of helping mothers. So we ask the following questions. What kinds of parental leave policies do top US companies offer? Are these policies aimed solely or mainly at mothers, or do they treat mothers and fathers more equally? And following from that, what effects do gendered policies have on the length of leave offered to mothers and fathers? So in order to do this, we use data from Fortune 500 companies collected in 2018. So what we did was we went directly to the companies themselves, first to their websites, often an HR website, to see whether they offered paid parental leave or some kind of leave. And then we also looked on the internet at respected news sources and organizations that collect this information. So if it was published in the New York Times or a respected source, then we would use that information. We did not use crowdsourced information like Glassdoor.com or Fairy Godboss. Following that, we contacted all of the companies to see if they had more information, or if there was no information on the internet, what their policies were. So we contacted every company multiple times via email and phone. We did not hear back from 111 companies, and then 36 companies refused to give that information. So in the end, we had a total sample of 353 companies from the Fortune 500, so 71% of the companies. So one of the main contributions of this study is coming up with this gendered parental leave classification that is specific to US employers and gendered policies. So we have 6 classifications, right? The first is gender equal, which is given to those companies that provide equal periods of paid leave to mothers and fathers, whether they explicitly mention mothers and fathers or just all parents as equal. And these range from 1 to 52 weeks for both mothers and fathers, and clearly there's no difference between mothers and fathers. The next category is gender modified, and these companies provide at least 6 weeks of paid leave to both parents, plus an additional 6 to 8 weeks to mothers. So in this case, these companies are drawing on the idea that 6 to 8 weeks is a reasonable time to give for physical recovery for birth mothers. And so the amount of time given to mothers versus fathers is more for mothers by 6 to 8 weeks. The following two categories are gender unequal, and we distinguish between gender unequal low and gender unequal high. So for both gender unequal categories, companies provide 2 or more times the amount of paid leave to mothers as they do to fathers. In the case of gender unequal low, it's twice as much or more, but 8 weeks or less. So still keeping within that 6 to 8 week range. Whereas for gender unequal high, it's 2 or more times for the amount for mothers as for fathers, and 9 or more weeks. So there's a likelihood that these companies might be that this might actually form discrimination against fathers. The fifth category is gender neutral gendering, and these companies offer paid leave to what they call primary and secondary caregivers. And so in theory, have the possibility of operating more equally, but in practice, often there are ways that companies are signaling that, and sometimes literally directly, that primary caregivers are mothers and secondary caregivers are fathers, right? And so these policies provide more to mothers than to fathers. And the final category is those that don't have any paid parental leave. Okay, so how do the Fortune 500 companies, how do they show up on this classification system that we've developed? Okay, so first of all, we can see that 72% of companies do have some kind of paid parental leave policy. So the 28% don't, that means 72% do, right? So when we look at those companies that do have, or all companies, we can see that only 17% of companies have gender equal policies. So the majority of companies have unequal policies. 12% are modified in terms of trying to take into account some of the physical recovery for mothers. Gender unequal high and low make up 35% of the company policies or the companies, and another 8% fall under the gender neutral gendering category. Okay, one other way of looking at this is to look at the type of parents who are specified in the policy. So we broke this down for mothers, fathers, parents, to see who's being actually named in the policies. And we could see that 74% of the leave policies mention mothers, right? So mothers only, mothers and fathers, mothers and parents, mothers, fathers, and parents. So it's only 11% are only mothers, but some combination will mention mothers, right? So only 12% of policies specifically mention fathers, right? Mothers and fathers, and mothers, fathers, and parents. So in all of those cases, mothers are also mentioned, right? And then we have a quarter, 26% that mention parents only. Interestingly enough, a few companies do distinguish between mothers, fathers, and adoptive parents, and in all but one case, offer more leave to adoptive parents than to fathers. Okay, so let's look at the mean leave, length of leave by policy classification. You can see here the red bars are for mothers, the blue for fathers, and the gray for adoptive parents. And you can see that the classifications along the bottom for those companies that have a policy. So we have clearly the only equal categories are the gender equal, right? And I should note that overall, the overall average for mothers in the companies that have parental leave policies is 10 weeks for mothers and less than 5 weeks for fathers, right? And we can see that the longest averages for mothers, right, is in the gender modified and the gender unequal high categories, followed by gender neutral gendering. And for fathers, the highest amount of leave is in the gender equal and the gender unequal low categories. But overall, there are really wide disparities between mothers and fathers in all of the categories except for gender equal. And just to give you a sense of how extreme the differences are, I'll just give the examples. So mothers receive over 3 times the amount of leave than fathers under the gender unequal high category. Mothers receive over 4 times the amount of leave that fathers receive under the gender unequal low category. And mothers receive 4.5 times the amount of leave that fathers receive under the gender neutral gendering category. Again, assuming that primary caregivers are mothers and secondary are fathers. Okay, so I'm just gonna wrap it up, and what do we get from this, right? What kinds of policies do Fortune 500 companies, the top companies in the US, offer? Well, the good news is that a clear majority of these companies do offer paid parental leave, so that's some progress. Unfortunately, gender unequal policies tend to be the most common policies that are offered, which suggests that companies are still seeing women and men in very gendered ways, thinking of mothers as caregivers, and fathers clearly are not seen as a priority with these policies. In terms of the length of leave, we see that mothers get more leave under the gender modified and gender unequal policies, and fathers get more leave under the gender modified and gender equal policies. And interestingly, mothers and fathers both seem to get less leave under the gender neutral gendering policies. It's important to note that that mothers getting more leave can be negative for women as well as for men, right? So this kind of policy emphasizes mothers or women as mothers, and often then in turn women or mothers are penalized in the workplace, right? At the same time, fathers who try to take leave often face some kind of stigma or flexibility stigma or penalty, right? So where do we go from here? Just a couple of limitations. First, the Fortune 500 companies are a select group, right? They're the top US companies. And so they're leaders in this, and most people working in other companies are not having access to leave. We did have a decent amount of missing data, and it's likely that our study overestimates paid parental leave because it's likely that the companies that have these policies were more willing to participate. We'd like to look at other contextual factors, things like the gender composition of companies, female leaders. Unfortunately, we didn't have this information. The only thing we could use was female CEOs, but in 2018, only 24 of the Fortune 500 companies had a female CEO. So finally, I'd like to say that our study contributes in a couple of ways, right? This is the first study to systematically compare parental leave policies of the top US companies. So that's a big contribution. And also the typology that we've developed really helps to understand more of the nuances of gender dynamics. So thank you for coming to our talk. And if you'd like, this paper is now available online under the Community Work and Family Journal. Thanks very much.